All right, this is immigration and citizenship attorney Parviz Malakouti Fitzgerald, and this is our 11th mobility space on Twitter, on X. And today we're talking about the concept of the detained man's switch, the detained man switch. So before we talk about the detained man switch, I'm actually going to talk about the inspiration to this, which is the cousin, which is called the dead man's switch. Okay, and I put a Wikipedia article in the links for the mobility space so anybody can read about the dead man switch. But the dead man switch is basically a switch that is designed to be activated or deactivated if the human operator becomes incapacitated, such as through death, loss of consciousness, or being bodily removed from control. And I'm reading that from the Wikipedia page. Originally applied to switches on a vehicle or machine, it has since come to be used to describe other intangible uses. What other intangible uses? Well, if you scroll down, you get to the use that I'm interested in. And anybody who's ever seen an 80s or 90s thriller knows about the dead man switch. And that's basically blackmail, okay, or some sort of insurance policy. The term dead man switch is sometimes used to describe a form of defensive blackmail or insurance file in which the release of damaging material is threatened if anything happens to the person. So the dead man switch, basically the concept behind it is that if a person dies, okay, and they have certain information that they need to be released, they've set up a protocol, a trigger and a protocol ahead of time, okay, that automatically activates basically in the absence of their intervention. That's the purpose of the dead man switch, right? So in those movies, we all remember the lines, if anything should ever happen to me, my lawyer has, the whole file and the videos and everything in there, in his office with instructions to release it. That's the dead man switch. Okay. Now, what about the detained man switch? Okay, so this is the same concept, but basically to try to get help, for a person to be able to get help when they're detained and they don't have access to the outside world. Okay, so what I wrote in my tweet from April 17th, and I've also linked it here, okay, is the term dead man switch is sometimes, or excuse me, that's dead man switch. Okay, detained man switch, a defensive mechanism that in the absence of intervention automatically triggers to alert certain people, i.e., family members, lawyers, journalists, etc., to one's last whereabouts and the possibility of having been kidnapped or detained. Those people can, in turn, act on a pre-planned protocol to help one escape kidnapping or unlawful detention. So we're basically talking about a way, some sort of, let's call it an insurance policy, a way to try to get help if you're detained or kidnapped or somehow incapacitated and unable to basically, have communication with the outside world. Um, the concept, the concept has been around of the detained man switch. People have used it. There's rudimentary detained man switches. There's more complicated ones. I've just not heard it actually be discussed as a concept, even though it's existed. There's a lot of high-profile examples. Recently, there was Greta Thunberg. Okay, she released a video that says, "If you're watching this video, I have been, kidnapped by the Israeli forces, etc., etc." She obviously set up a detained man switch, okay, to somehow trigger to release that video if she's, captured by the IDF. There's also the case of Jamal Khashoggi, okay, who was famously tortured and murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul back in October 2018. And, the details are kind of murky because all the information hasn't been released to the public, but there are recordings of that torture and murder. And those recordings, Turkey, basically Erdogan said that they distributed those to foreign governments. That, in my opinion, is highly suggested that Khashoggi set up some sort of dead man switch. And there were articles that indicated that he may have basically set up his Apple Watch, okay, to trigger to start recording, after a certain period of time. And it may have been a recording of his own murder that was picked up on his Apple Watch that was then sent to a cloud that his fiance waiting outside had access to. These are examples of what I call the detained man switch, okay? Simple concept, okay, but it can be deep. A trigger and a protocol. A trigger basically something that basically contacts a certain person that gets the thing going, okay, in the absence of intervention. The protocol, what happens after that first person is contacted. Okay, so the protocol could be, contact so and this journalist, contact my wife, my attorney, contact the embassy, etc. I think this is increasingly an important piece for people that are, multiple citizens, for people who travel a lot, people who have footprints in a lot of jurisdictions. The more jurisdictions you have contact with, either physically by traveling through or being resident in, or even non-physically, okay, by virtue of basically pulling yourself into their jurisdiction by doing business there or having any type of contact, the more jurisdictions you have contact with, obviously the more law enforcement agencies you have contact with, the more elements you have contact with, even the more criminal, organizations in different countries you might have contact with and come on the radar for. And I think that that extra complexity, okay, makes it more valuable to have a detained man switch, okay, because if you, for example, if you take two extreme examples, an international businessman, okay, he travels, resident in 4 countries, citizen in 3 countries, travels to business to another 5 countries. He's coming into contact with a lot of different law enforcement agencies in countries that may have greater or lesser judicial due process than, for example, somebody on the exact opposite of the spectrum. Okay, let's call it a small business owner who has a brick and mortar business. Let's call it a donut shop. Okay, donut shop in Las Vegas, Nevada. Right. That person, he's subject to jurisdiction primarily in the United States, Nevada. Okay, the possible universe of law enforcement agencies or people and agencies that would have the capacity to detain him is much more limited than the person in the first example. And so this is how I kind of became interested in this, the concept of the detained man switch, and trying to get some conversation going around this to basically get together protocols, perhaps best practices, make this kind of a thing that exists, that is accessible to everybody, anybody, especially who travels internationally. You can have a rudimentary detained man switch, in my opinion, all the way to the opposite of the spectrum, a complicated detained man switch. I think the most rudimentary detained man switch that you could have is just simply telling, your wife or your friend or your lawyer, hey, if I don't call you by 9 a.m. tomorrow, then contact the embassy. Okay, that's a detained man switch. It's a very rudimentary one. And obviously you could have a much more complex one set up, especially with technology, an auto emails, that sends out if you don't stop it from being sent out, or for example, a smartwatch that has a recording device that does something. There's a lot of obviously ways of setting up a more complex detained man switch. So that's my introduction to kind of how I look at the concept. We have Patrick here, we have Alex here. Let's get into some discussion about the detained man switch. I'll kick off with a question for Patrick. Okay, so Patrick, my first question is, what do you think a detained man switch should be? And the second part to that, generally speaking, is who benefits most from the concept of a detained man switch?
Ooh, that's a great question. So please let me know if there's a lot of noise in the background. It is record heat here on the East Coast, so I am currently at the beach. Um, I think there's two ways to look at it. There is the detainment switch for resolution, which is typically looking at someone who's can help, who's from the legal profession or from consular services. And then there's the one where it's public facing, where you're like, it's either political or it's so detrimental to your personal safety that, like in the example of Jamal Khashoggi, hey, if I'm going down, I'm taking you all with me. There's two different ways to kind of do it. And I think for the average person who's not a known quantity, like Alex Navalny had a detained, sort of had a detained man switch as well through his wife. Um, I think the way to look at it is to say, if you're not a person who is a big political person or a celebrity or a known quantity, if you're just a regular international traveler, then your detained switch probably is going to be legal, legal or family aid. Um, and I would say it benefits the international traveler. It benefits the person who's a guest in someone else's country. It also benefits you if you're a citizen of a country that you're in, but maybe you don't have the language skills or the familiarity with the customs or law enforcement culture there. And if you don't have that in place, then you're a person stuck abroad, potentially with language issues, unable to help yourself. Um, and I think that having the detained man switch, it starts. I think there's ways to do it, right? There's ways to mobility prep with levels. There's ways to set up a detained man switch with levels. I think the bare basic one is to have that timed email. Send it, have it Gmail lets you pre-schedule emails up to like a year out. I think have it 48 hours. Have it go to your lawyer and maybe consular services at the same time. And so, you have the power to pull that email back if everything's fine. But if you're not, and it's assumed you're detained, and in that detained man switch, you're reaching out to your lawyer and to consular services. That effectively creates a group dynamic and has two second parties accountable to each other in absence of you. And so I'll leave it there, but I think it helps the international traveler, the international guest, the traveler the most, um, and it allows you to set up, especially today with technology, it allows you to have a allows you to set up even at a basic level some type of perspective dynamic that pulls together a resource or a safety net should you be detained.
Yeah, the international traveler. Also, there are other profiles that I think the detained man switch matters for, right? So, one just from my own practice is first of all, let me back up for a second, Patrick. I think the concept of the detained man switch goes hand in hand with the green box, right? The green box is the box, whether tangibly or intangibly, whether online or in person or both, with critical information, okay, about you, private information, right? If you have a detained man switch that sets up and links to a protocol that gives somebody access to, your green box, they're going to have access in theory to information that can help you more while you're detained, okay? And I'll give a perfect example, okay? A lot of people that are undocumented in the United States are nervous, right, with all the work that ICE is doing around the country, okay? In the United States, undocumented people who can't prove that they've been physically present in the United States for at least 2 years are subject to what's called expedited removal under INA Section 235. That means that they can be deported from the country without even a court hearing. So that creates a threshold, okay, proving at least 2 years residence in the United States, okay, versus not. Now, think about this from the perspective of a person that's detained, okay, an undocumented person that's detained, okay. If they're detained and the ICE or CBP is trying to subject them to expedited removal, okay, that person has to prove that they've been present for longer than 2 years in the United States. How are they going to do that? Their phone's taken from them. They don't have access to the outside world. They don't have their computer. They don't have any of this stuff. Okay. And that type of documentation obviously, takes, some time and, first of all, it takes the will, somebody to know that this needs to be generated. That's the first thing. Secondly, it takes somebody to be able to do it. Okay. So those people would be benefited, okay, by having a green box. Okay. I'm using it, um, I'm using it like in the sense of an intangible green box, a cloud with information and documents proving that they've been present in the United States for 10 years or whatever, okay? And critically, third-party access to that cloud. People that they trust have to have access to the cloud. Now, that's the protocol. That's the protocol. That's not the trigger, okay? You need a trigger, right? A trigger is what you said at the beginning, Patrick, the auto email, okay, or just on a rudimentary level, just telling your lawyer, your friend, good friend, if you don't hear from me by so and so date, try to contact me, and if you can't, assume I've been detained, okay. Now that person, the undocumented people, okay, of which there's estimated over 10 million in the United States, they're going to benefit from having a at least a rudimentary detained man switch connected with a protocol that's connected to a green box that people they trust have access to. So that's something that I recommend for people. Anybody who has consult with me that's undocumented, I recommend that they set up something like this. Okay. Now, what about the possibility of a false alarm, right? Some people have said, well, I don't want to create panic. Let's say I said an auto email. It says, if you get this, assume I've been detained. Well, obviously you're going to end up with some situations, some false alarms in some circumstances are going to be inevitable. But the easy way, okay, that's going to eliminate the majority of them is first line says in the auto email, if you've gotten this email, I may have been detained. Please contact me. If you contact me and can't get a hold of me within 2 hours, please assume I've been detained and proceed with the protocol. That's it. Okay. So say you said an auto email, we're all fallible. Maybe we said an auto email and you meant to basically take that off and you forgot to take it off and it goes out. Okay. That the trigger to your detained man switch goes out. Okay, that's fine. Have it in the protocol clearly that the person that's receiving this, your outside person, your outside man, is to contact you. If they contact you and you're not detained, okay, you say, oh my bad. Okay, yeah, you contacted me. I'm not been detained. If it's your lawyer, okay, here's your 100 or 150 for whatever it is for your time for having received that email and called me to check up on me, right? So I don't think that the detained man switch has to be complex. It can be complex, but I think a huge amount of the benefit, if not the majority of the benefit of it, can be derived with a very simple rudimentary setup, right? As long as people that are involved in this understand what it is, they understand the concept, they understand the protocol, and of course that they have the courage to proceed with the protocol and not just default to saying, oh no, I'm sure he's fine, he just forgot to take off the auto email. So going back to scenarios, so profiles in which this might be needed. Okay, so number one, of course, multi-jurisdictional people, travelers, heavy travelers, heavy business people. Number two, undocumented people, like I said. Number three, political dissidents. Okay, Khashoggi, Thunberg. Okay, the list goes on and on. Number four, people who are vulnerable to kidnapping. Remember, the detained man switch isn't just for detention by a foreign government. Okay, you could also use it for kidnappers. Okay, there's certain countries in which it's open season on kidnapping rich people for ransom. Okay, so Brazil, for example, is like that. Okay, some South American countries, those people could benefit from a detained man switch. People traveling, especially to lawless jurisdictions or jurisdictions without robust, right to a lawyer, okay, or due process. And then finally, another profile is dual citizens who travel to countries that are kind of known for using, for detaining dual citizens as bargaining chips. Okay, and it's tough sometimes to determine how much of the reports on this happening are just media focusing on a dual citizen being detained versus an actual indication that dual citizens are detained more often. But two examples that come to my mind are Russia and Iran. Okay, Russia and Iran, are demonstrated in the media. They're presented in the media as kind of targeting dual citizens, their own dual citizens. So, for example, American Iranian dual citizen travels to Iran, or a British, Iranian dual citizen travels to Iran and getting detained, okay, and then basically having, the government, the foreign government, Iran, Russia, or whatever government, use them as a bargaining chip in order to try to get something, extract some benefit from the foreign ministry of that foreign country. Okay, so that's another, I guess, profile for which the detained man switch, would have use case. Now, one other kind of, I guess, dynamic, okay, that comes to my mind is I believe the detained man switch is most useful when there's a higher risk of the person being detained without being able to have contact with the outside world. And on the opposite spectrum, less useful. That doesn't mean not useful, but less useful, okay, to the extent that the person can be expected or would be able to have quick access to the outside world, right? Just as an example, right? Detained man switch is inevitable, okay, or not inevitable, invaluable. If you're detained in a country that holds you for 100 days and nobody knows what happened to you, you don't get any contact with the outside world, for your loved ones and people in your life, it's just like you disappear. Detained man switch has max value in that situation. On the flip side, okay, in a scenario in which you are detained and you get, one or two or three calls within 24 hours, okay, in that scenario, the detained man switch loses its relative value, right? Because you can act as your own trigger, okay, from detention. Now, the big thing is you never know ahead of time. You can never know ahead of time, okay, whether you're going to be detained for 1 day or 100 days before you get access to the outside world. We can know what the law says in a particular jurisdiction about what the person is supposed to be entitled to. But as everybody knows, what the law states versus what actually happens in practice are two different things. They're not the same. Sometimes they track and sometimes they don't track, right? So there is a volatility in not knowing ahead of time, which scenario you might end up in. Okay, which of course basically, gives greater value to the detained man switch. Okay, because if you're uncertain, to the extent that there's uncertainty about whether you'd be able to have a call out, you get value from the detained man switch. So we got Alex, we got Drew. Drew in LA is in here. Um, Alex, can you speak? Or are you just listening today? Okay, let me ask. Okay, let me follow up with a question. Another question for Patrick, because Patrick's talked about the green box before. Okay, so green box, um, box of information, data, documents that's critical to a person. Okay, that's what we call the green box. Um, Patrick, to what extent do you think the green box should be linked to a protocol for a detained man switch? I mean, do you think obviously this is going to be a person by person analysis, but do you think generally most people are served by giving an outside person access to the full green box, okay, all the documents that they need, or do you err more towards the idea of having kind of a limited green box, that's narrowly tailored to what risk you think you're trying to fight against with the detained man switch?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm a big fan of the green box. Google actually has their own form of it, but it's a 2 month window, and it's mostly for people who have since deceased, and then they forward all the information off to someone you designate. But I think in this example, that the green box works because I mean, there's two ways to do it. You can either proactively manage what's in there, depending on your situation, or you can keep it as a repository and have it double as that green box and Detainment switch. I think that's harder to do, but um, if you have a lawyer on retainer, then obviously they're going to respect your privacy. Um, but I wouldn't necessarily blast the green box off to consular services, right? Um, and there's different things you'd want in the green box. You probably want things that prove your identity, like a digital copy of your birth certificate. You probably don't want things that can lead to, that are unnecessary and lead to fraud, like your social security card, like a digital copy of your social security card. So, I think you want to provide evidence that will be useful in your scenario. And I have a great example here. I guess I'll share it now. A personal example. Um, I was traveling. This is 2018. I was traveling from Colombia to Panama, and I was flying a flight that does no longer exists post COVID. And um, I was doing a 4 month consulting gig in Panama, and it was a weird arrangement because they didn't have the time to sponsor me. So they basically said, "Work for free, and we'll basically take care of all your expenses here." And so it was a way to get around the litigiousness or the bureaucracy of like sponsoring someone in Panama. And then they had one of their projects they were scoping out in Colombia. It was a real estate project. And so I was flying back, and as an American, I get stopped landing at Albrook. If you're familiar with Panama, most of the flights go into Tocumen, but Albrook is their national flight. So I was flying one of the only international flights into a national airport. And we were the last flight of the day, and there's like 60 people on the flight 'cause it's a small E-jet, and I'm one of the only Americans on the flight, and so I get pulled aside and get the full search because they assume, I'm in Colombia being a degenerate and deciding to take back a recreational amount of drugs. And so they decide to search me up and down, go through all my suitcase, pull out the lining of my suitcase, the whole shebang. And in that moment, I realized that obviously I'm not into that lifestyle, so it was completely fine. But the point is, I was a guest in one country A, country B. I'm a citizen of a different country, and at that point, you're basically up to the deference of immigration control and security control at the airport. And they were fine, but in another country, they might have required a bribe. In another country, they might have found something else um, to cause issue, and then suddenly you're being detained. Maybe there's a language barrier, and it made me realize that in a scenario like that, I would have a problem because I was doing a consulting gig. I did not have a worker's visa for the country I was landing in. So the justification as to why I was in one country and the other could have been an issue. I would need documentation to prove, hey, I'm doing this on paper for free, um, and I need that to be in a form that's usable, right? So I can't just show them a bunch of copies of emails in English. And so I think, in that case, a standard green box with who you are and your identity and your personal information would have been insufficient. If I was detained there, and I'm pretty convinced the reason I wasn't detained is because I spoke to them in Spanish. But if I was detained, I would not have had the specific evidence to prove that I had a right to be in the country, that I wasn't a hooligan doing degenerate things. And so I think that green box is great, but it does require a little bit of active management. And, we live in a world where you can tier that information. You can say, you know, my lawyer gets full access. If I'm in a pinch and I need to send stuff to the consular office, which you can set up ahead of time. You can let them know you're in the country. You can register, oh, I'm going to, you know, fill in the blank country, a country that maybe a developing country. Just let the embassy know that you're there. In a way, that's the original Detainment switch. Um, but then they can maybe have that tiered access to the basic information that is potentially helpful to them. So there's really like a potential creative way to design it. You got to have faith that the other parties have the know-how and the incentives to use that information appropriately, which is probably why the, the person with the most access either has to be your lawyer or a trusted and capable family member.
Yeah, that's a great anecdote. Patrick, it also occurs to me that there's at least two benefits of the detainment switch, right? There's the first benefit, which we've been speaking about almost exclusively until now, which is the ability to get help if you're detained. Okay, you're detained, somebody outside is alerted to the fact, and a protocol is set in place, okay, for that person to follow, basically to put things into motion that can help you get out, okay? But there's also the deterrent aspect, the deterrent benefit, okay? And the deterrent benefit, right, was largely, at least the way the dead man switch was presented in the movies, right? Like that was largely considered the benefit of the dead man switch. Okay, it's like if you harm me, you're going to be screwed because your most damaging secrets are going to be released. And Khashoggi, right? Khashoggi largely demonstrated, I mean, it was tragic what happened to him, but he largely demonstrated the deterrence value, okay, of the detained man switch, okay, by recording, or I think, we think, I believe, somehow triggering a recording of his torture and his murder, okay, because that imposed an enormous cost on Saudi Arabia and MBS, right? Tons and tons of not just horrible press and diplomatic pressure, but business. A lot of business interests canceled conferences and all kinds of stuff in Saudi Arabia. It cost them a lot of money. What Khashoggi, basically, what happened to Khashoggi, right? And the fact that he was able to aid in presenting evidence of his own murder, okay, by what he did, is a deterrence, okay. Like if this is a repeating game, then Saudi Arabia or any other country or even a criminal group is going to be less likely to try to do something like this in the future. It's the cost imposed on them is much greater, which means that if they're a rational actor, they're only going to act to detain that person or to do terrible things to those people if they perceive the benefit is worth the cost to them. Okay, so obviously the more cost you impose on somebody to do something, it decreases the chance they're going to do it because it really has to be worth it for them. So I find so the recording thing is really really interesting from the perspective of not just how it could help you, but the deterrence, okay, that it can present. And I mean, in some ways, Khashoggi's, Khashoggi's act of deterrence is benefiting people who came after him. He unfortunately could not benefit from what he did personally. But if a lot of people have detained man switch, and it includes recordings, okay, of the first seconds or minutes of somebody who attacks them or detains them, that's going to eventually factor into the equation of how these actors act to the extent that they're rational. Okay. The other thing is we've all seen the movie Taken, right? Taken. Okay. So with Liam Neeson, we all remember what happened, okay, which is basically when his daughter in the movie was under the bed and about to be kidnapped. Liam Neeson said, okay, he put the recorder on, and he said, leave your cell phone on, and when they take you, shout out every bit of detail, okay, that you know. And then he obviously famously, analyzed the hell out of that recording and picked up clues and eventually hunted down the Albanian criminal group, right? Now, obviously, the film was great and exaggerated, in a lot of ways, but there's some real lessons in that, right? If you can make a recording of your own kidnapping or detention and send it out to people who are either competent themselves to analyze it or can get it in the hands of people who are competent to analyze it, well, you're giving as many clues as possible to people who are trying to help you. Okay. And when people disappear, remember, from the perspective of the outside world, if you're detained without access, okay, the outside world, whether it be by an aggressive government or a criminal group, whoever, to the outside world, it's just like you disappeared. Okay, from their perspective, you just disappeared. They don't know where you are. They don't know what happened to you. They don't know where to look. And in those cases, obviously, the recording, if you can record, is invaluable. And nowadays, I mean, Taken was I think it came out in '06 or '07. In 2025, I mean, darn near, I don't want to say every smartwatch, but tons and tons of smartwatches, have recording devices. You can rig it so it records and automatically sends to a cloud, and have somebody on the outside have access to that, et cetera, et cetera. And so, the cost of setting up these detained man switches, even especially with a recording option, it's just lower and lower, right? The more that tech becomes cheaper, and I think the cost of setting up the switch, versus the benefits a person can get from it, have reached the point that it's just it's worth it for a lot of people to set one up, even a rudimentary one. I just believe perhaps the concept and the idea of the benefit of it hasn't really proliferated. I don't know. I mean, that's my thought. Obviously, I'm always thinking about these things, mobility. I think it's a concept that's going to catch fire eventually. It just may take a few years or 5 years, 10 years. But let me put a question out. Am I delusional here? Is this kind of just a really niche thing, or is there anybody else who thinks that having a detained man switch in one way, shape, or form is going to be commonplace in 5 or 10 years? Patrick, what do you think? Is this kind of out there?
Yeah, I don't know if it's commonplace yet. I don't know if it'll be commonplace in 5 years, but it will definitely be more used. And I say that because the vectors for its use are just increasing. You have you have very very well publicized issues at immigration and customs enforcement right now in the United States. At a bare minimum, the likelihood that that will be reciprocal now or in the near future is pretty high. A lot of countries, particularly in a world that is increasingly disrupted, um, face reciprocal policies is right in our face. Like the United States uh, faces U.S. citizens face visa in Brazil now because solely because the Brazilians said we don't care for horse tourism. It's just fairness. Brazilians require visas to go to the US. The reverse should be true. And if people are being given a tough time to the extent that they're potentially detained, I think we're going to see that broadly across the world. Um, and on top of that, um, the vectors for being detained are increasing because you have a world where policies are differentiating at a faster and faster rate. I mean, look at Brittany Griner in Russia. Now, do I think it's wise to have any form of controlled substance crossing the international border? No. But it is so commonplace in the United States that if you're so infrequently traveling for work and then suddenly you are, and you're caught, you know, with that type of issue, yeah, of course that's grounds to detain someone. And then guess what? You're a star and suddenly now you're leverage, right? Um, Obviously disproportionate response, but from the Russians, but they don't care. It's you're detained because of who you are, not because of necessarily what you did. And so I think lessons like that, I think are going to increase more and more. And you know, all it takes is a few stories from friends, because that's how people learn. They learn from stories from their friends. And all you have to do is hear a few stories from your friends, and suddenly you're like, you know what? Maybe I should do X, Y, and Z to protect myself. A lot of people are deleting chat apps even U.S. citizens, when they cross the border, because they know that that can be searched and it's not an issue. Uh, and so, I think people are going to continue to take steps to protect themselves. Whether or not comes into commonplace to use this type of detained man switch, I don't know. But I'd guess like 20-25% of people 5 years from now are going to have some sort of setup like this.
If it's 20 to 25%, I would consider that an insane increase. Okay, and way more mainstream. Yeah. I mean, how many people have a detained man switch right now? It's got to be less than a percent. I mean, even a rudimentary one. So, yeah, I agree with everything you said. And the high profile cases, they provide case studies, right? Because they're high profile, they're covered by media. We learn details. We get to learn details of a story. But I think some people might confuse that with meaning that, oh, I'll never be in that situation. That's just a one in a million, this type of high profile. No, they're valuable for learning about detainment switch because we learn a lot of information about them. But millions of people are being detained, okay, all across the world every year, okay, without being able or being very limited or delayed until they can actually contact somebody in the outside world, okay. Mahmoud Khalil, okay, the green card holder who was arrested, detained by ICE, and basically they tried to deport him. Early in the litigation, it was a big point of a big issue of when he was detained to Louisiana. I'm sorry, when he was transferred to a Louisiana detention center. When, right? If he had a detained man switch, especially if you had a recorder on him, okay, ostensibly he might have been able to automatically record some conversation or things that were said around him, okay, by officers about where they're taking him at what time, and all that information can be timestamped, of course. All the people that were sent to CCOT, okay, in El Salvador, right? Anybody who's subject to detention, whether sudden or not, could potentially benefit from a detained man switch. So the high profile cases are illustrative, but I think we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that these only have value if you're somebody that's super high profile or well known dissident, things like that. So anyway, I'm repeating myself at this point. We got Jay's in the house now. We got still Alex. We got Drew. Jay, what do you think? What do you think about a detained man switch? Worth it? Not worth it?
Durable in some way. Like if you're going right, if you're a U.S. citizen, let's say you're going to Russia, then maybe it would be a good idea to have precautions in place. Or if you are someone maybe in the U.S. who's not a citizen at this point, maybe that would be a good idea. But I would say you probably know if you're vulnerable, or you should know if you're vulnerable, and that's probably a good a good rule of thumb is like if you feel like you are going to be in a vulnerable position or you're going to put yourself in a vulnerable position, then that is something that might be worth doing.
Yeah, agreed to the extent that you can accurately estimate that, right? Um, right now, there are over, I believe, still over 100 Israeli hostages held by Hamas in Gaza. Right? It's been over a year, almost 2 years now, right? um, the big question is, where are they, right? Obviously, Israel, everybody who would like to see innocent civilians returned would like to know, where are they, right? That's critical. Now, I presume they've probably been moved around a lot, but if those people had a detained man switch, especially with a recording device, right? Or they might be in a different scenario, or some of them might be in a different situation. I'm not saying for sure, okay, but possibly. The other thing is, I mean, Mahmoud Khalil, the guy that I mentioned before, he was picked up by ICE and started this whole long ordeal of effectively being kidnapped. I basically consider he was kidnapped by the U.S. government. He was at a naturalization interview. He was about to naturalize, right? And he was basically picked up and they tried to deport him based off of his speech, okay, his pro-Palestinian speech, right? So the idea, you know, the idea that we can kind of rely on not at least being, taken through the ringer of a judicial system, reliably, I think that idea is kind of crumbling a little bit, and it's a shame, right? Like our confidence in due process, the idea that that would never happen. Trump the Trump administration, okay, both the DOJ as well as his own press secretary, okay, basically they said outright, we're exploring ways to legally be able to deport U.S. citizens. He said it, okay, he said it, and the DOJ is advancing arguments actually to try to lay the groundwork for that. Right now, I hope that never comes to fruition. I hope we never come close to that happening to fruition or coming to fruition. But mistakes happen. We've already seen through the ICE raids throughout Los Angeles, California, and throughout the country that they have detained, at least for a short period of time, mistakenly U.S. citizens. There was a guy in Florida who was in detention for a week. He was a U.S. citizen. He was in detention for a week until I believe it's his mother showed up with his birth certificate to basically get him out. So the more our confidence in due process crumbles, at least for me, I believe it's crumbling. I'm sure, I don't want to get too political, but maybe not everybody, everybody might not agree with me on that in the United States. But I believe that there's kind of a little bit of a, more than a little bit of an attack on due process. The more there's an attack on due process, I think the more people benefit from being able to, contact the people who can help them if they're in need and if they're unable otherwise to have contact with the information. In other words, having a detained man switch. All right. Go.
Yeah, I'll jump in here also. And I know we keep using the US as an example, which I think is good because it's relatable and understandable. Um, but never forget that in a good part of the world, immigrations and customs individuals, have to pay for their own uniform, and they're typically underpaid by government. And in many countries in the world, there may be some degree of due process, but there's also levels of corruption. And you might not know where suddenly you don't have access on your phone because of a SIM card issue, um, or you're going to a country where the internet is prohibitively expensive, like Cuba back in the day, and suddenly you're detained because you're the last person off the plane, and the detention person wants you to slip them a 20 or 30, and you don't have any cash on you, and then they detain you, and then suddenly you find yourself in a situation that you may not have had an inkling that that was going to happen to you, but it has. And anyone who's dealt with law enforcement or like deployed military officers in a foreign country, which I have on at least 3 occasions, knows that it's kind of up to their discretion whether or not you're detained. And so I do want to lay into it that I don't think there's always an easy, binary between, yeah, I should probably be worried because I'm going to Russia. But what happens if you're going to 3 countries in Central America? You know, Historically they're generally pro-America, but you could catch a guy on a bad day, and that's suddenly a vector for being detained.
Yeah, it's a great point, right? This is multi-layered. You could be going to a country or jurisdiction where by law they can detain you and lock your ass up for 100 days without being able to contact somebody. That's one layer. Another layer could be you're going to a country where that's not allowed by law, okay, but whoever's in charge at the time, the executive or the head of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement or the head of the National Police is for now unlawfully imposing the policy of we're going to lock people up and not give them, a call or access to the outside world. That's a second layer. Third layer is what you just said, Patrick. Okay, which is it could be illegal by law there. Okay, it might not be policy to do so. Okay, but you have your rogue, agent or agency or section of an agency or section of a law enforcement, agency that's acting to try to shake you down or having a bad day or whatever it is, and they could detain you, right? When you're locked up, when you're detained, okay, from your perspective, it's all the same. Okay, if you're detained and you don't know why you're being detained, you have no access from the outside world. It's a fine distinction for you, okay, whether it's because it's by law or it's done unlawfully, right? In the moment, you need people from in the outside who can help you to know that you've been detained, know as much information as possible about your detention, and obviously be put in the position, as good of a position as possible, information wise, to help you. So I think that's an excellent point that you just made, Patrick, right? Like, a customs agent in a country that's otherwise free, that's acting under color of law, he's got power over you, whether he's acting lawfully or not, right? And so that's something, from a practical perspective to try to protect against.
I guess I would say part of it is your familiarity. Like how well do you know what's supposed to happen in this country, and like how confident are you that things will go as planned?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, right? That's all data. If you're traveling to a country where it's, known that, people with your profile oftentimes, get detained, then yeah, that implies one level of preparation. Whereas if you're traveling to a country where this, hardly ever happens, and if it does, people robustly get access to a telephone within 24 hours, etc., then yeah, then that's, that's a lack of an incentive to spend time and money and energy on setting up a detainment switch. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Jay. 100%. It depends on what your expectation is, to the extent that your expectation actually tracks with reality. I mean, to the extent that you can, that you're actually on point with what to expect. But yeah, I mean, if you're present in a country unlawfully, right? Whether because you're undocumented or, well, yeah, let's call it because you're undocumented. That to me is, to me, de facto, the default should be that you should have a detained man switch, okay? Because by law in that country, you can probably be detained, okay? Which means you should have some sort of setup. Let's talk about some of the setups, I guess the basic setups, right, for a detained man switch. Patrick and I at the beginning mentioned an auto email, right? An auto email that goes out, right? I mentioned, what I consider the most rudimentary, detained man switch, right? Which we've seen in movies too, right? I mean, how many movies, there's two guys in a car and, one guy's going in and he says, if I'm not out by 20 minutes, get out of here. If I'm not out by 20 minutes, come in for me or something like that. That's a detained man switch. That's a rudimentary detained man switch. But we got the auto email. We got the, if you don't hear from me by, then do this, right? What else? I mean, what about the possibility, another layer of complexity? Okay, you set a smartwatch. You activate a detained man switch by setting the recording on a smartwatch, right? When you go through, let's call it a point of entry to get into a country, you have that upload to a cloud, and you've had somebody, you have somebody on the outside set up to basically review that recording, okay, and see if you were detained, or to contact you, when you're expected to come out on the other end, right? And if they can't get a hold of you, then to activate the protocol, right? What do we think are the low energy, the low effort detained man switches, right? And then I think the other question that's relevant is, what do we think are the low energy, the low effort detained man switches, right? And then I think the other question that's relevant is, what do we think are the low energy, the low effort detained man switches, right? And then I think the other question that's relevant is, what do we think are the low energy, the low effort detained man switches, right? And then I think the other question that's relevant is, what do we think are the low energy, the low effort detained man switches, right? And then I think the other question that's relevant is, what do we think are the low energy, the low effort detained man switches, right? And then I think the other question that's relevant is, what do we think are the low energy, the low effort detained man switches, right? And then I think the other question that's relevant is, what do we think are the low energy, the low effort detained man switches, right? And then I think the other question that's relevant is, what do we think are the low energy, the low effort detained man switches, right? And then I think the other question that's relevant is, what do we think are the low energy, the low effort detained man switches, right? And then I think where are the red zones where you should try to activate a detained man switch, right? The first one that comes to my mind is when you're coming to a new country, okay? When you're going through a point of entry. That's a red zone, okay? Another red zone that I could think about is, for activating a detained man switch is if you're, traveling to a country that has poor rule of law or is controlled by a militia or is controlled by an organized crime group, right? Or if you're you know if you're if you're a wealthy person traveling, if you're wealthy and you're known to be wealthy and you're traveling to a place like Brazil or a place that it's known that they kidnap rich people, then maybe your red zone that you activate the detained man switch on for is for the entire trip, okay, to that country. So to me, these two questions go hand in hand. Okay, like what are the red zones? Okay, the common red zones to think about activating a detained man switch, and then secondly, like what are the cheapest, both in time and money expended? What are the cheapest, detained man switches that people should look at or think about, depending on their profile? Patrick, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think we spoke to them initially. I think it's the timed email. I think the timed email that links to that has a link to like a Google Drive or like a Proton Drive or something, um, that has the documents that you potentially would use in your situation. And also, you know, particularly if you're using a lawyer, they theoretically should already have some of this information um, ahead of time. So you might not even need to have the drive. The drive is helpful because it allows you to share in a moment of being detained. But I think the other inexpensive aspect to it is to also include a family member, because a family member theoretically, hopefully for everyone, cares about you, but they may not have the means or knowledge to help you in that situation. So their added benefit is to act as a secondary person to help everyone stay accountable, right? So if an email goes out to um, an auto email goes out to, say, your lawyer and family member, they together can say, hey, did you hear anything? Did you hear anything? And confirm. And suddenly it's a lot easier for that consensus to work for you than just one email alone in the night to one person. And I also think that for international travel, it's best to do it if you're going to a new country. Um, if you regularly carry basic things like prescription drugs, if you have any vices that are potentially illegal in a country, then you should probably set up a detainment switch. You know, for me, I occasionally like Cuban cigars. Uh, you know, I've brought a few back before under the purview of the US government, and they're okay. The quantity is fine. But if I were to try to bend those rules, I would want to make sure that I'm not doing so in a way that would get me stalled or detained, right? And so if you dabble in that, I think it's helpful to set up a detainment switch. Um, I think part of it, you hit the nail on the head. If you're going to a country where there's aspects of the country that are not not controlled by the government, that's a huge aspect. In many places in the world, if you're an American, you're assumed to be wealthy. Um, there's few scenarios where um, you wouldn't want that, right? Because all it requires you to do is to do research to say, hey, if everything is great, am I able to get Wi-Fi or internet connectivity within, say, 48 hours of arrival? If the answer is yes, then it serves you to set up a detainment switch. There's very few situations in the world where you're landing at, say, an airport and you don't have Wi-Fi. Um, so I think that there's broad applicability. I think where for a rudimentary design, where it becomes a little more difficult um, is if you're living in a country and you don't have the paperwork and you're undocumented, then you're hitting that auto schedule send every time you're pulled over or anytime you access a government service. So it's a very different scenario. But I think for someone who is, has their paperwork in order and is traveling internationally, um, I don't really see a huge downside to having it teed up ready to go. All it is a draft email and a set aside piece on the drive, and you can just set it, unset it when everything is great, and then you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, exactly. I think having two people on the trigger, okay, so the trigger contacts two people is critical for redundancy, right? If you only have one person, maybe they they don't see it, maybe they archive it by accident, maybe they're not motivated enough to actually act on it, right? So I think redundancy is critical. That's got to mean at least four eyes, two people. And I am a fan. I am shaping up in thinking that one person, at least one person on the trigger, on the receiving end of the trigger, should be a family member. Okay, because of that higher level of interest, higher skin in the game. Okay, somebody, nobody on earth is going to love you as much as your mother does. Okay, yeah, your mother might not be as capable, right, as far as contacts and knowing what to do and stuff, but nobody's going to be as motivated as your mother, right? And then obviously by extension after that, other family members, right? um yeah, I mean, the auto email, it's low cost. It's super low cost, right? Especially if you have a line up front that says, if you're receiving this email, please contact me first. Check with me to see if I can, if you can reach me, and if you can't reach me, within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever, proceed immediately. Super low cost, right? And that's an easy Detainment switch. One thing that I have, I won't get into too much detail, but I think it's just, I'm happy to share this. I have a list of professionals that I think would care if I were detained. Okay. So on one hand, it's journalists. So I have a list of journalists that I have a relationship with. I think they would care if I was detained by a government. They would be interested enough to either assist in some way, okay, through their contacts, or possibly, if it falls within their beat, actually even write an article about it. Okay, so I have this list along with their contact information on a cloud. Okay, that the people that are on the receiving end of my trigger have access to. Okay, and they're reminded periodically, to consult this list if necessary. So that's journalists. Okay. And then, of course, lawyers. Okay, the lawyer contacts that I have, that I trust the most, that I think would be motivated the most, or I have an arrangement with in different countries, right? So this is this is evolving. I'm still figuring out myself, and updating and changing and improving my own Detained switch. But this is not that hard. Okay, I mean, perhaps even if you have no contacts, let's say you don't know any journalists, you don't have any, contacts with, I don't know, people that are connected or whatever. At the very least, you could have your trigger go to, your consulate and your family member. Okay. And, let's say maybe your lawyer. Okay. If you don't mind basically paying a lawyer to have for your Detained switch, or if you have a relationship with one, right? That's not that hard. Everybody can do that. And then obviously, to the extent you're in contact with people that, are more connected, you might want to loop them in on the Detained switch, not necessarily as the direct trigger, right? Here's my idea, and I'd be happy to hear from anybody else what they think of this. I don't think the people on the receiving end of your Detained trigger should be the big wig. I think you should have your contact people who care about you, who you have a relationship with, that are willing to act and motivated to act on your behalf, and they in turn should contact whoever is the people that actually have, whether the journalist or the person that's going to act on your behalf, the removal attorney, whatever it is. I think the default should be that the first people on the receiving end of the trigger are not actually the action people. Not in every case, I'm inclined to believe that that's better as the trigger. But what do you think, Patrick? What do you think, Jay, Alex? Should you remove? Is that an unnecessary layer of complexity, or should you launder the, not launder, that's a terrible word, or should you screen the Detained switch trigger through an intermediate group that's kind of more interested in your well-being?
I mean, I guess for me, I would say some of my contacts, like, well, let's say I were detained in Brazil. I went to study abroad there for a year. Let's say I were detained there. I would, if I were to only contact my closest family members or friends on my first email, right? They would have a pretty hard time getting and going and contacting my contacts in Brazil who don't speak any English. So that poses a problem immediately. Not looping the folks in that country who didn't speak English onto the original email that I would be sending out.
Right. So that would have to be accounted for in your protocol in order to be effective, right? Either the people you
Sure.
contact would have to know Portuguese, or the people that you're contacting would have to, their protocol would have to say the first person they contact is the person who can, reach out to the lawyer or whoever it is. But yeah, that's a good example, right? Of perhaps removing the middleman, right? If there's a huge language barrier, or look, let's be real, people have different levels, people's family members are at different levels of competency and ability to follow instructions, right? That's just the fact. Okay, so some people are going to have fewer people in their life that they trust, that they think are competent enough to just follow the instruction and drive it through. That's got to be a consideration as well too.
Yeah, I think it kind of comes down to, it's gonna sound terrible. How much do you trust yourself? Because if you're on top of things and you know that your detained man switch will never go unless you are truly detained, then it should go to the big wigs, because the one time it does go through, you need you need to show up with the big iron, at you know so to speak. But if you don't trust yourself as much and you're like, oh hey, sometimes I might land in a place, me and my friends, everything's fine, and I just forget. Well, then you probably want to go to your family member, because your family members, again, they all have different levels of competency. I mean, most people who speak English every day have a hard time reading a English legal document, so they're not going to be able to read, Brazilian Portuguese, uh, uh, legal or administrative documents. But they do care, and therefore they can follow up. And I think that's the value, right? Is that they can follow up with the big guns, and I think that's where the consulate comes in, right? The consulate, which theoretically is there to provide services to you as a citizen, um, does have staff that can speak, uh, on your behalf in the language of the jurisdiction. So if you're in Brazil and you set up the detained man's switch, then yeah, maybe your mom knows that you're detained. Maybe you CC your lawyer, maybe you don't, and you CC the consulate. Well, then suddenly the U.S. consulate, who has Brazilian Portuguese speakers, know that you've been detained, and they're going to call their contacts to confirm that you've been detained or not been detained, and what your status is. And then suddenly if you have CC'd your lawyer, they can contact your lawyer and see how you'd like to proceed. I think there's different ways to design it depending on the country. I think Brazil's a good example, but it could also be a situation where you might be, you want to go to a really cool favela, and then someone decides they want to, steal you for a day to see if you got any ransom on your head. You know, is that likely? Probably not, but it's not a 0% chance. And then suddenly you haven't been detained by government officials. You've been detained by people who probably don't even have a Brazilian birth certificate. And so in that case, the consulate's probably going to be your best option, because then they can interface with the parts of the Brazilian government that can find you, right? Because they know these areas and they know the language. So I think there's different ways to design it, but I think it comes down to how much do you trust yourself, to flip that switch when it's needed.
Good point about how much it depends on yourself. I'm going to push back on the idea of not having the family member be the next contact. And here's why. If you deal with professionals, which I know you do, Patrick, and some others on this call too, consulates, government officials, their priority is not to help you. They may end up helping you, okay, but they're contacted by dozens or hundreds of people that they have competing interests for their time. In my opinion, the most important asset to have in a situation like this is an advocate that's highly motivated, okay, a high motor advocate who's going to contact, and follow up, right? And that type of dedication for most people is typically only going to come from somebody who actually just loves them, just cares a lot about them, right? Or I'd say the exception being if you have a Detainment switch set up with somebody like Radha Sterling from Detained in Dubai, okay, their business, their whole organization, the purpose of it is to help people. It's called Detained in Dubai, but they don't just help people that are detained in Dubai. They help people in other countries. The idea is exactly for this situation. You are stuck, you're detained, you need help basically, marshaling, circling the wagons to help get you out. If you have somebody like that, okay, fine. You can set something up ahead of time with them, right? And directly contact them and maybe CC your own mother or your father or your husband, your wife, or whoever it is. But if it's a journalist, if it's a lawyer, even if you have the agreement with your lawyer, but if it's not really the primary thing that they do, if they're kind of just doing this as like a side thing, or if it's a consular official, they're not. They're going to need to be. I mean, it's sad to say, but they're going to have to be ridden and followed up with, okay, over and over and over again. Somebody's got to be there. That's got to be showing I'm here. I'm following up on behalf of this person who urgently needs help. And I'm not going away. I'm calling back next hour and next hour and next hour and next hour, okay, until you either help me or you tell me to fuck off, okay, in which case I know, okay, I'm not going to waste my time here. I'm going to go on to the next person in the list. And so that's my beef with going direct with the detained man trigger that triggers directly to the big wig. They're just not incentivized, generally speaking. Of course, there could be some exceptions, and like I mentioned, they're not going to be incentivized really to help you. And for people that are in this situation, right? If you study these scenarios, the ones that are high profile, or if you've ever been involved either directly or indirectly, it's follow up. It's literally hundreds and of calls. I mean hundreds. I don't mean that I mean that literally. It's hundreds of calls and follow up and email and showing up and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. That's what it is. And that dedication typically, I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, typically comes from somebody who loves you enough to kind of drop what they're doing and figure it out. We're talking about an emergency here. We're talking about like life's on the line. I mean, we didn't talk that much about the macabre aspect of the detainment. I mean, the macabre aspect of it might be you're detained and you're gonna be executed in a short period of time if mountains are not moved, okay, to get the attention of whoever the person or agency is that have you and show to them that you're gonna incur a big cost if you execute this person, right? Like there's that movie with Robert Redford and Brad Pitt. I forget the name of the movie. Great movie, okay, which is it's a spy movie, Spy Games, I think. Brad Pitt is captured by the Chinese government. They're going to execute him in like 18 hours. Okay. And Robert Redford is moving heaven and earth to basically figure out how to get him out. Right. That happens in real life. Okay. Especially in some countries. In some countries, they don't make a big deal. They don't give you notice. Hey, the person's been sentenced to death. They're going to be executed this day. Some countries, they just tell the family members the person was executed in the month of May. Okay. And here's his belongings. And that's it. So that's the more extreme aspect. That's the macabre aspect, but that's an element, okay, of being detained when there's an unknown. Okay, it could be that as the clock ticks, you're moving closer to your death, right? And so that's kind of my pushback. I guess the vulnerability I think that I see with just going directly to the bigwigs. Again, accepting the scenario in which in which case the bigwig is dedicated to this type of work and they've been handsomely rewarded to basically act on your behalf, or they can reliably know that, hey, if they act and drop everything and really, circle the wagons, they're going to get their money. They're going to have their incentive to do the massive amount of lifting that's potentially going to be taken in order to help you out.
Yeah, Spy Games. That's a great movie. My favorite part of that movie is where Robert Redford is in front of a bunch of his colleagues, and he's supposedly on the phone with his wife, but he's actually talking to some sort of strike operations, and he says, "Operation Dinner Out is a go," and all of his colleagues are like, "He talks to his wife that way? No wonder he's on his third wife." And nobody knows that he's actually giving instructions to free Brad Pitt. But it reminded me of another movie, and that is The Covenant, which came out on Netflix maybe 2 years ago. And it is about an Afghani translator who helps. Oh my God, I can't believe I'm blanking on his the actor's name.
Jake
Tony Darko.
Jake Gyllenhaal.
Jake Gyllenhaal. Yeah, Jake Gyllenhaal. He's the lead, and he was saved by this Afghani translator, and their roles are then reversed, and he needs to get him out of the country, otherwise he's going to be killed. And there's this scene where he's on the phone with USCIS, calling and calling and calling. And I remember watching that movie, and I thought to myself, I don't know how many Americans understand how real that scene was, because here's a person's life on the line, and it isn't a lawyer, it isn't a family member, it's someone who cares, and they're willing to put up with all this ridiculousness to get this guy out. And so I think that's a good even though it's Hollywood, I am from California, so I think it's a good representation of like showing that at the end of the day you need someone who cares.
Patrick, I'm preparing the outline for a reaction video that I'm going to record. Immigration Lawyer reacts to that scene, not just that scene, but other aspects of the Covenant as well. That is a fantastic illustration of what it's like to actually try to get something done with USCIS, especially over the telephone. You're exactly right. Average American has no clue that's how things work. Okay, when you're dealing with big government bureaucracy and you're trying to get something done that doesn't fall directly in their cookie cutter, process or procedures. That's called an SIV, Special Immigrant Visa. That's what was offered to Afghan translators and other allies of American forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. And yeah, that's unfortunately a lot of those allies and people that were promised those visas have been left behind, right? But yeah, the Gyllenhaal character cares enough, and that's what drives him forward, right? Congress members, calls to USCIS, and then eventually he takes out, I don't know what it was, $150,000 or whatever, and pays a private contractor, military contractor, to go in and get this family out. It's a fantastic illustration. It's very real, I would say. Maybe not the aspect, the aspect of paying money to get somebody out, that also happens as well too. That's still real, but perhaps way less common, right? But the rest of it's legitimate. So yeah, that's what I think. That's what people should expect to be required in order to move the people in power to help you, okay, if you are detained, right? So for a person that's setting up their detainment switch, one of the first considerations should be, okay, who can I loop into this that's going to do that for me? Okay, who's going to do that for me if I'm detained? Okay, people got their own lives, they got their bills to pay, they got their own kids, they got their own stresses, they got their own worries, they got their own deadlines. Okay, who cares enough about you? Okay, whether because they just love you or because they're financially incentivized enough to do so, that they're going to make really tough sacrifices in their own lives in order to execute the protocol, okay, that you've set out for them, and beyond that protocol. I think that's the way people should think about who should be on the other end of the trigger for a detainment switch. Yeah, thank you for bringing up that movie. I actually was not even thinking about that movie when I was talking previously. But yeah, I'm going to record an immigration lawyer reacts video for those scenes.
Another red zone that I don't know if you guys mentioned earlier was immigration checkpoints in within countries. I know the U.S. has them and the DR does as well. I'm not sure about other countries, but they do exist.
Yeah, U.S. has them, especially along the southern border, Arizona, Texas, right? And we've all seen videos of people going through there and recording their interactions with CBP. Great, that's a great point, Jay. That could be another red zone where you activate, a detained man switch, especially if you are undocumented or if you have reason to believe that you would be detained and possibly put into expedited removal proceedings, traveling through those areas. And yeah, other countries have them too, definitely. Jay, the reason, a lot of people don't know this, but one of the reasons that those immigration checkpoints can exist, okay, and they can hassle people passing through, right? Without reasonable suspicion of some sort of criminal activity, is because functionally the U.S. border it extends 100 miles, okay, from the border, 100 miles inland, okay, and that gives CBP a lot of ability and rights, okay, to do things with the general populace that they would not be able to, otherwise do, okay, and that's one of the reasons that these checkpoints exist. So, yeah, a lot of people don't know that, right? And I mean, I think one of the kind of like important principles with the detained man switch to think about is sometimes when something is done to you unlawfully, whether it be detention or otherwise, okay, even when it's done unlawfully, it can sometimes take days, weeks, or even months for you to grind through the legal system in order to reclaim your freedom, right? You got to think about that, okay? That just because somebody might be listening to this and thinking, I'm a U.S. citizen, I have nothing to worry about. Yeah, until you're targeted, until you have to prove that you're a U.S. citizen, right? As a practical matter, right? You might be, like that poor guy in Florida who was detained for 8 days, right, before he, was able to prove that he was a U.S. Citizen and then got out, right? Now, I don't think we're at imminent risk of, U.S. citizens en masse being detained and having to prove that. But it does happen occasionally, and I think it's just illustrative of that principle. You have to remember, in law, especially detention as applied in practice, it does not always directly track with what's supposed to be right under the law.
Right. One of the things that we kind of think about is Kilmar, Abrego, Garcia. Even though he's not a citizen, but he was detained and sent to a foreign prison. And they were able to sue and make noise and eventually get him out. And now he's back here. He's still in proceedings, various types, but he is not in prison in El Salvador right now.
That's exactly right. And for weeks, nobody knew, well, not nobody, okay, but the people who counted in his life didn't know where he was. Okay, they didn't know if he was even in CCOT or in a private government building or where exactly, right? That's a great example. I've called Kilmar Abrego Garcia the modern day Count of Monte Cristo, okay? Just swapped up off the street, okay? No hearing, no nothing, and just basically rendition to a foreign prison, right? That's abhorrent, of course, okay? That's just horrific that has happened, and that the U.S. Department of Justice has continually argued in court, okay, to defend that position. It's terrible. It's horrible. Like I don't even know what to say about that. But that is the reality that we're living in now, okay, in the United States. And of course, in other countries, in plenty of other countries, that's kind of been the norm, right, for a long time, right? The cost of a detained man switch is just so low now in terms of effort and money, in my opinion, that the threshold for it to make sense to have one is just really low now, in my opinion. All right, so we're at 12:23. We've been going for an hour and 20 minutes approximately. Anything else that any other comments anybody has, or any other aspect of the detained man switch that we want to talk about? This won't be the last time that we talk about it. This is just kind of my first space to kind of introduce the concept. I've introduced it. Well, the concept exists, but basically my thoughts on the concept I introduced a couple months ago. I want to flesh this out. I'm going to write some articles. I'm going to do some videos. And, I really just, I'd like this to kind of spread in the community of people who travel and are multi-jurisdictional, just for the sake of, individual human freedom. So this is definitely not the last time I'm going to be talking about this. I want to flesh this out, think about it, hear other people's input, do more research, more study in previous, detained man switch. switches, and then come out with an article, kind of laying out what I think are some best practices. But any other comments? Anybody want to, talk about any other aspect of it before we talk about topics for our next space? Okay, so I think we're going to wrap this one up. Okay, so topics. So for everybody listening, mobility spaces, we're doing 50 of them this year. This is number 11. We're doing these Mondays and Thursdays. Okay, to the extent I can, I may have to reschedule, at some point, but for now, we've been consistently doing Mondays and Thursdays. Anybody can join, anybody can speak. Okay, we're talking about topics related to dual citizenship, sovereignty, freedom of movement, and of course, mobility. Next topics. Okay, so a couple topics that I had in mind. One topic that's been kind of dangling around, which we've been talking about getting into, but we haven't yet, is the concept of where is the EU headed? Okay, where is the EU headed? That's one topic. Another topic I had on my list is the concept of free cities. Basically, the question is, should you have a residence in a free city in your residency portfolio? That's the question as I posed it. Okay, that's one topic that we could talk about. And then the other topic, so as far as there was an article that came out from Immigrant Insider about, it was called Major Airlines Sold Passenger Data to Border Agency in Secret Deal. I've been wanting to talk about this article, but I've had a hard time scheduling with Pablo Manriquez, the guy who runs Migrant Insider, in order to get in, to join our space. We could still proceed with talking about that topic, okay, without him if we want. Obviously, it'd be way better if he can join, but we've had a hard time planning. But these are my three proposed for now topics for Thursday. So where's the EU headed? Should you have a residency in a free city in your portfolio? And then also this topic about major airlines selling passenger data. Do you guys want one of these three topics, or should we go in a different direction? I'm open to other topics that I didn't mention for Thursday.
I really like the CBP information. If we can get Immigrant Insider on the space. Otherwise, it's really in vogue to, do summer in Europe. So I think where the EU is headed from a travel perspective, I think since it's the beginning of summer-ish still, I think that's still pretty topical. So because, where ETIAS goes, changes in citizenship by descent for a couple of countries. I think there's a nice open an open kind of framework of considerations as to where the EU goes for both citizenship and for just visitors traveling and transiting through.
Thank you. Jay, any preference for the next topic?
I think that talking about where the EU is headed is probably a very good topic, considering the amount of Americans who are looking now to get dual citizenship with EU countries by descent.
All right. Alex, any preference for the next topic?
Yeah, I think where the EU heading is an interesting topic. I also think it'd be interesting to talk about procedures when border crossing to reduce the odds of being detained, or if you're detained, the damage for being detained. So it's kind of related to today's topic, but somewhat different as well.
Yeah, that I'm really interested in that topic as well. I have that listed on my master list, actually. Best practices for passing through the border. Okay, let me think about it. I'm gonna put a poll up. Okay, asking people what they think, and then I will basically I'll consider what you guys mentioned as well as far as preferred topics. Alex, did you have one last thing to say?
Yeah, I think that I agree. It's a low-cost thing to have, and I look forward to seeing what solutions come out over the coming years to make it easier to have a detainment switch.
All right, wonderful. Thanks for that input. Okay, that's it. I'm going to put up a poll for the next week's topic. For Thursday's topic. That will be space number 12. But I am leaning towards where is the EU headed, based off of the feedback from everybody here. Thank you all for joining. Thanks for everybody who joined anonymously, and make sure you tune in for our next one. It's going to be Thursday, this Thursday, probably at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Have a great one, everybody.